Hey everybody, now we're going to look at Chapter 2, Near East Empires and the Reemergence of Civilization in Greece, 1000 to 500 BCE. Now I'll be skipping some things in your book because the way I teach this is it's just like I would be in class. So if it takes like an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes for a video lecture, that's like a 3-hour class lecture, 2.5, 3 hours class. Because in class, you're asking questions, your hands. Usually when I show pictures, I have a little class discussion. What do you think about this? We talk about things. I'm not doing that here, obviously. That's what your class discussion board is. That's what your PSAs are, to sort of flesh out some of that deeper understanding and more analysis of the material. Things that were missing sort of being in class. Well, so I'm not going to be extending my video lectures beyond my normal class lecture, just to make up a 3-hour class. So I cover the same material here that I would in a class lecture, and it obviously is a shorter time period. So I say all that because you're going to see through this that I skip some sections. There's some sections in your book that are there that I don't cover. I've made up slides for all those. Initially I had slides for pretty much everything. I cut those out. So as you'll see here in a minute, when we start, we're starting on section D. There is an A, B, and C in your book, but I'm not covering that. And of course, you don't have to worry about that come test time or whatever. So you just have to worry about what I discuss here. Still, lots of great information in your textbook beyond what I talk about. Plus, things in your textbook could still be relevant when it comes to discussions or exams. You could refer and reference things in your textbook. So, we'll start here with the Israelites, Hebrews, Jewish population. So, origins to 539 BCE. So, the Israelites' development of a monotheistic religion, the first one in the world, probably somewhere around the time in the mid-second millennium, 13, 14, 1500s BCE, they developed this monotheistic religion. First one in the world, belief in just one God. Originally, the Jews were polytheistic like everyone else was. And then they changed their entire belief system to focus on one God, Yahweh. This religion makes them a principal building block in Western civilization. Sometimes Western civilization is also referred to as Judeo-Christian civilization, referencing Judaism, Jewish people, and Christian. You'll also hear that terminology referring to Western civilization. They were never a great empire. They were never greatly unified, even. They were unified maybe for a century and a half. 800-900, something like that, BCE. For a while. Unified. So never a great empire, never unified, other than for a short period of time. But their influence reverberates through all of Western culture. Judaism develops over a very long period of time, probably a few thousand years. They were originally polytheistic like their neighbors were, like everyone else was. And then eventually they changed to this monotheistic divinity. This is certainly a turning point in all religion. They're the first one, certainly not the last. Christianity and Islam become monotheistic as well. They have their sacred scripture, the Hebrew Bible, certainly affected the development of both Christianity and Islam. Both Christianity and Islam are basically it's the same God. They're all worshiping the same God, just by different names and different understandings. But both Christianity and Islam give credit to Judaism as sort of their forerunner, their predecessor. Hebrew sacred scripture, referred to as the Pentateuch or the Torah, set forth Jewish religious code, Jewish moral code, and it also forms the covenant, which is this agreement between Yahweh, God, and the people, the Jewish people. You worship me as the only one God, and I will protect you. And we know this comes about as a result of their interactions with, they were captured and in captivity by the Babylonians. They were captured and enslaved by the Egyptians. And generally speaking, they've been always a persecuted, attacked people that have been typically oppressed by someone. The Babylonians, Neo-Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians. Someone had pretty much always had authority over them, other than for a short period of time of a couple centuries. So the idea of what Yahweh offers is really important. It offers protection. It offers you're the chosen people. God will protect you, and you'll worship Yahweh, this male deity, as the only one God. Which really, of course, helps focus their population as well. It was really common in this time period for people to move into other cultures and then assimilate into their culture and adapt to their culture, and Jewish people felt that they were going to lose their culture. So we see Jewish leaders really focusing on these moral code, moral rules of society to keep them together, to keep the Jewish population cohesive. We saw other populations that would move into, like the Hyksos people moved into Egypt. They conquered part of Egypt. 100, 200 years later, Hyksos are gone. Their entire culture has been merged into Egyptian culture. Well, the Jewish people probably feared something like this happening to them as well. Them simply being merged into other cultures and simply disappearing, or not having any type of authority or power. You are exposed to worship this only one God, live by his laws, and chosen people, and he promises safety and security and prosperity. Another really important thing. Hey, the Jewish people are treated as slaves among any other population, but if you stay with the Jews, you stay among us, the sacred scriptures treats everybody equally. Everybody should be fair. Everyone's equal under God. So you'll be treated fairly, more equal. You'll have more authority, more prosperity, more opportunity if you stay with us. All right. The content of the Jewish scripture is actually very similar to Mesopotamian law codes. We actually see, you can actually, if you look at certain Jewish scriptures, certain texts, and you actually look at Hammurabi's code, for instance, which was this ruler in Mesopotamia. Bear in mind, the Jewish people were in captivity in Mesopotamia at one point, and probably would have had access to the writings and the teachings of Mesopotamians. You can actually match up lines in Jewish writings with Hammurabi's code, almost word for word. Literally, almost entire phrases are completely copied over. It's pretty obvious that there was the Hammurabi's code and Mesopotamian civilization was very influential upon Jewish scripture and Jewish writings. But there is a big difference. Jewish law codes and scripture applies to all people equally, regardless of social class. And Hammurabi's code, of course, delineated social classes very clearly. So the Jewish people, they borrowed or copied or were influenced by some things, and then other things they chose to reject. Now, according to the Bible, the patriarch Abraham, who is this father of them, the traditional father of the Jewish society, migrated to the region of Canaan. Canaan is sort of the modern-day area of Israel, the eastern Mediterranean, sometime around 1900 BCE. The Jewish people were typically nomadic, sheep herders, goat herders, pastoralists, didn't really have cities, nothing like that. Eventually, the Hebrews migrate into the region of Palestine, which is sort of the southern edge of the Mediterranean along the east coast. And eventually, in the 1700s BCE, they end up in Egypt, where they're enslaved for, give or take, 400 years. All these dates are circa dates. These are approximate dates. But it all pretty much matches up with history. There is historical evidence of the Jewish people in Israel, in Babylon, Jewish people. So much of what is theological scripture, which you can choose to believe or not, whether your religious beliefs, there's actually a decent amount of historical evidence that a lot of these things, as far as the actual events, did actually occur. The Hebrew deity is Yahweh, which leads Moses out of bondage, supposedly parting the Red Sea, goes over to the Sinai Peninsula, goes up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, receives the Ten Commandments from God, and this is where the covenant is formed. Maybe around the year 1300, circa 1300, is when the covenant is actually formed with God by Moses and other leaders. 1300, 1250 BCE. Well, the Hebrew people really had never been a nation, never really been a state. Very loosely organized tribes. Basically, they were tribal peoples. Still haven't written anything down. They still, pretty much all of their laws, their oral traditions, all of their scripture, if you will, had been passed orally. Had actually been passed down from father to son and family to family. So still nothing really written down at this point. They eventually become a monarchy under Saul, King Saul, and then King David, and then King Solomon. These are the three patriarchs, the three great kings, which really formed the only time when we have an actual Jewish state, until modern time with the state of Israel. Sometime around the year 1000 was King David, and then Solomon in the 950s, 940s. And they form the Jewish state, which is on the east coast of the Mediterranean, generally where modern-day Palestine and Israel is located. Now, Solomon dies. Solomon dies around 922. Around Solomon dies. It splits into two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. So almost immediately, the Hebrews start fighting among themselves. The Jews start fighting amongst themselves. And you end up with two different kingdoms. Technically, they were an empire because they did conquer. They had to actually conquer the people in Palestine, the Canaanites, or sometimes referred to as the Philistines. They had to conquer them using force. In the name of God, they killed people. That's the way it's always been in human history. In the name of some higher power, I kill you, and that's okay because God orders it. This is not a condemnation of the Jews. It's the way it's been everybody. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and every other religious group have always used this as an excuse to kill others. God approves it, or God says to do it, so I do it. Well, Jews are no different. Christians, Muslims, they all have done it. So God approves this holy war, and they defeat the people because they believe this is their ancestral homeland. They believe this is their, they conquered Jerusalem, and they believe this is where they're supposed to be, this location. Jerusalem is an incredibly holy site to the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, all very important holy site. So they eventually collapse into two different kingdoms, warring amongst each other, almost quickly, within just a generation or two after Solomon's death. And we get these two nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel is eventually conquered, and Judah is eventually conquered. They're both conquered by the let's see, and I don't quote me on which is which. This is from memory. So Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, and Judah is conquered by the Babylonians, or the Neo-Babylonians, or reverse. Either way, the Neo-Babylonians come in, the Assyrians come in, and separately they conquer both Jewish kingdoms. And this is it. So this period of history, maybe 200 years, from the 700s to the 900s, we have the only time we really have a Jewish state until modern times. So for 250 years, we had an actual Jewish, quote-unquote state or country. The country is the modern term we use for this idea. So eventually those, many of the Jewish people are carted off as basically slaves to Babylon. They're actually taken away as slaves into Babylon, and this is the Babylonian captivity. And this lasts from most of the 6th century, the 500s. So most of the 500s BCE, they are slaves of the Babylonians, until Babylon actually falls to Persia and collapses. The Jewish people escape. They go back to Israel, or back to this region around Jerusalem, and they're only I don't know, stable there for a generation or two, and then they themselves are again conquered by the Persians, which at the point in the 500s was the greatest empire in the world. So literally every time the Jews escaped, they were conquered by someone else. No matter where they went, they were always persecuted and conquered by somebody. That's certainly true. You know, you hear that talking about Jewish populations always being persecuted. It's real. For pretty much the last several thousand years, anytime the Jews turn around, someone is trying to oppress them, conquer them, or run over them, or assimilate them into their culture. But that also happened to a lot of other people too. So it is the way of. It is true. This certainly leaves a huge mark on Jewish history and Jewish culture. Constantly being pushed out of their homeland or having their homeland conquered by some foreign entity. It has been often happened. Now, this diaspora, let's see if I have it on here. The diaspora is pretty much what we call this dispersion of the Jewish population. Now, you could say around the world. Back then, of course, around the world would have been mostly Middle East regions, which is actually pretty big. I mean, that's Western Asia. It's actually a pretty big area. So they never really had a homeland again, so they were constantly being pushed around to other places. And Jews almost become tribal again. Don't get me wrong, they spent a couple years as city dwellers. They developed technology and some skills, and merchants and traders and business people, which was very significant considering they were on the trade routes across Central Asia, the old ancient Silk Roads. So they developed some of these skills, but after Judah and Israel fall, they become almost tribal again, having to be pushed around, moved around. Although they still focus, still find them mostly in smaller cities and towns. Rarely did large numbers of Jewish population ever return to Jerusalem or areas around Jerusalem until modern times. This is what we refer to as diaspora. Basically, they're dispersed all over the place without an actual quote-unquote home. Very complex religious laws and teachings, and this is really where the religious laws and teachings come into play. This is around the time they start writing everything down. We start seeing the scriptures put down on paper or whatever they used back then. I don't think they had paper, whatever they used. And we see it being written down because they're trying everything they can to maintain their cultural identity. They're now spread all across the world, the old world, and they're trying to maintain cultural identity. So it becomes very important and significant for people to follow rules, follow the laws, follow the codes, and maintain their identity while living in foreign lands. Quite a challenge for the Jewish population to do. This focus on monotheism, this focus on ethical behavior, this focus on moral law, it really allowed the Jewish population to maintain cohesion to where culturally, religiously, they haven't really changed much in thousands of years, a couple thousand years. This strict adherence to their moral law written in their scriptures, which was the goal, to maintain their cultural identity, which is probably really the goal of the religious writings in the first place. Whether you choose to believe the religious aspect of it, it had a purpose, and it worked. It really maintained Jewish cultural identity. However, the cultural identity of Judaism has heavily influenced Western culture. Significantly, obviously, Christianity grew directly out of Judaism, and Islam was influenced by Christianity and Judaism. So, yeah, you can't really stress enough how influential Judaism has been on Western culture, along with lots of other things. So, goddess figurines from Judah. So, even at the time of Judah, even at the time around the year 900 1000, it still appears that some Jewish people were still polytheistic. This is actually from the region of Judah, and these are different goddesses. These are different gods. So, even in the 800-900s, some Jewish people were still worshiping multiple gods. Some of them were still polytheistic. Even though this covenant had been supposedly formed, 400 years earlier, when Moses took the Jews out of Egypt in 1300s. this is often the way things are. When things are written down, it's often revisionist, whether it applies to history or applies to religion. They write things down today, and they claim that the way things are today have been that way for hundreds of years. Of course, that has a hugely significant purpose. If you tell people, well, we have a brand new law today that we've never had before, people are doubtful. They're hesitant, like, why do we want to change? But if you tell someone, oh, no, it's been this way for 400 years, we just didn't have it written down yet, then it is more easy to convince people, oh, okay, well, it's always been this way. That applies, you see that all across the spectrum, religion and law and government, and you see it everywhere. We'll talk about it a lot with the Romans and the Greeks, how especially the Romans, they love to rewrite history and talk about, oh, 500 years ago it was this way. No, it wasn't. It was never that way. It's just the current emperor says he wants it to be that way, and so, well, okay, well, it's always been that way. That's bullshit. It hadn't always been that way. It's just easier to get the masses of your people to do what you want if you tell them, well, it's always been this way. So anyway, we have evidence that even in the 800s, some Jews were still polytheistic. So even though supposedly monotheism dates back a half millennium before this, or even at least that far back, we think they use them as like personal gods, family gods, like a particular god that would protect them. Sometimes referred to as a hearth god. It was a personal family because every family had their own little hearth, which is like a fireplace. Personal family protection. And this is probably one of the reasons in the Ten Commandments. There's one of the commandments is you shall not worship idols. An idol is a figurine. That's an idol. So one of the reasons you would put that rule in the Ten Commandments, the Jewish leaders, supposedly from God, is, hey, don't worship idols. In other words, stop worship, because there was no idol of Yahweh. The Jews didn't allow a symbol of Yahweh or a figurine of Yahweh, so stop worshiping all these other things. It was simply a way to try and force the population to move from polytheism to monotheism. To force worship, to force obedience, and of course, to force obedience to God's representatives on earth, the Jewish leadership and the Jewish clergy, the father of the family and the fathers of the different tribes. So, it's a system of control, but all religion works that way. Nothing unusual here, nothing different with this religion than others. All religions have aspects of systems of control of the population. It's just the way it is. Christianity, Islam, it's all the same. And I mention these three always because these are the three that are heavily influential in Western culture. I mean, we could certainly talk about Buddhism and Hinduism and other religious beliefs, but those particular two are far less influential on Western civilization than Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So those are the three I spend most of the time talking about when we're talking about religion. All right, let's shift gears to Greek civilization and the emergence of the reemergence of Greek civilization after the Dark Age, which is sort of what we ended the last chapter on. So we're going to look at the Greek Dark Age here. So after the fall of the Mycenaean civilization, probably around, circa 1200 BCE, Greek society endures poverty and depopulation for a couple of centuries, basically. During this Greek Dark Ages, from about 1200 to 1000, Greeks lost pretty much all distinguishing characteristics of civilization. They no longer had unified states. Very few people lived in cities. They lost writing. Basically, they lost the ability to write, communicate that way. We also know the land was cultivated less. Farming continues, but we consider farming probably mostly subsistence, which means just the basics, just to survive. Herding probably became more common than farming. Population became more nomadic. Pastoralists moving around the mountains, the hillsides. Remember the Greek mainland is very mountainous, hilly, rocky. No large cities, no major building projects, basically no culture as we know it. At least, just to be clear, nothing that survives. I mean, I'm sure there were still people playing music and there were probably things like that, but as far as anything surviving, no. Really nothing. For a couple hundred years, on the historical record, Greece ceases to exist. There's really nothing. Now, obviously, people still live there. There's lots of archaeological remains and evidence and remains of villages and towns and settlements. So, there were still people there. Just quote-unquote civilization seems to take a break for a couple centuries. We do know there's still trade. We do know there's still some wealthy people around, too. There's still some evidence of a few large homes, maybe even a handful of small regions with wealthy, large homes or farms. So there's still some wealthy elites in a few places, it seems. Lots of contact and trade with others, still continuing, because we still find evidence of Greek items outside of Greece in this time period. So there's still some Greeks making pottery, things like this. Contacts with the Phoenicians, for instance. The Phoenicians come from the region probably around Canaan. We think that might be where they learned to read and write again. They might have actually be the ones, because the Greek alphabet, as we know it, is totally different than Linear A and Linear B, which were the ancient Greek Minoan languages. Which tells us the Greeks lost the ability to read and write, and when they regained it, it wasn't the Greek language. It was actually probably the Phoenician alphabet that they then had, they took it, they tweaked it, it sort of came to resemble a little different culture, but at its base, it's the Phoenician alphabet, is what the Greek language became. All right, continuous exposure to Near Eastern art, continuous exposure to outsiders. We do know the Greeks learned new trade skills, new metallurgy. They do eventually learn how to make iron. The Greeks sort of skipped right from, don't get me wrong, to bronze, and then the Iron Age follows, but they had just really learned to make bronze. Maybe for a couple hundred years, they go to the Dark Ages, they come out of the Dark Ages, and boom, they're making iron. They did not learn how to make iron. It seemed very clear that one day there's no iron, and then suddenly there's a lot of iron. They bought weapons and iron implements from others, and further, they probably simply learned the technology along the trade routes. And suddenly there's Greeks making iron. They didn't make it themselves. They learned the technology from others due to their contacts, probably. Lots of contact with what we call the Near East, which is the Middle East, what we would call the Middle East today. Basically, Western Asia. What eventually we're going to start calling Persia, or the Phoenicians, the Neo-Babylonians, even Indian population, the Near East. Egypt, which is interesting. Wait, Egypt is actually south, even totally south of Greece. Yet Egypt in Western culture is considered the Near East. It is Eastern culture, even though it is most assuredly south of the Mediterranean and Europe. We consider Eastern culture. Also Syria, which is east of Anatolia, east of modern-day Turkey. So artistic development, religious developments, all of this. And suddenly the Greeks emerge out of the Dark Age, we're going to get to it in a moment, with all kinds of technology and capabilities that they didn't have before, just in the previous generations. They didn't develop these things. They pretty much borrowed them, copied them from others, probably having to do with the trade routes. Iron was very important. Iron was hugely significant in revitalizing Greece and reawakening the Greek culture, because iron allowed the creation of new weapons, stronger, more powerful weapons, armor. They learned how to have chariots. They learned to build chariots, swords, agricultural implements, plows and tools and things like this. Iron might be one of the most significant things which brings Greece out of the Dark Age. Changed the way people farm, the way people war. It made everything more efficient and more common, and really helped turn Greece around. That iron and language really seemed to change everything. We see food production increase. We see population take a sharp increase. as a result of this revitalization of culture from the Near East, Egyptian and Eastern culture, and the iron and the language. We see this sharp expansion and growth in just 100 years. Greek populations grow dramatically, we believe. Greek expansion increases dramatically, we believe, which also means Greek military might increases dramatically. And the Greeks eventually go right back on the warpath, just like they were before. During the Dark Age, lots of men and women competed. Competition was common. Competition for excellence, social status, competition for leadership. Remember, these were basically tribal people again. And tribal people are always competing, don't think sports, but they're competing for land, they're competing for opportunities, they're competing for prestige and status. And the Greeks have a term for this, arete. This idea of personal pride, personal excellence, individual excellence and authority in whatever your field is. Whether it's fighting wars, making, metallurgy, making pottery, whatever it is. And eventually this does become significant in, sporting as well, different type of sporting. Men achieved arete in a few ways. One of the most important ones was war, prowess in war, your war ability. Also the ability to speak. Persuasive speaking became important and significant. Once language is reintroduced and writing is reintroduced, becoming educated, an educated elite was a way of demonstrating arete. Your knowledge level, important. Religious observance was significant. The Greeks were very religious. That's interesting. I'm going to backtrack and I'm going to say that differently. The Greeks had a very effective or significant religious view, but on a day-to-day activity, was religion important to the Greeks? Not the way we look at religion today. If anything, more like magic was actually probably. The Greek religion was a blending of what we think of as spiritualism and magic. We'll talk more on that later. Women demonstrated arete through management of their households, having children, taking care of the farm, while the men were away doing things demonstrating their prowess. While men farmed, taking care of the home and the family and the farming lands was often an important role for women, because the men would go off and do labor, work, education, warfare. Very often the women were left home alone with kids to take care of everything. So women could demonstrate arete in those ways. Let's see what's next. Black vase figure showing women weaving cloth. We do have actually quite a bit of knowledge about what women and men did in this society. And interestingly enough, where do we get a lot of it? A lot of it comes from, because right around the end of the Dark Ages, while they did rediscover writing, we don't have much, because, it's basically a new technology for them. No one alive had really known what writing or that was. So what do we know about them? Around the Dark Ages, a lot of what we know about the Greeks is from pottery. Now, this pottery comes a little bit later in the Dark Ages. This is the 500s. But still, a lot of what we know about the Greeks comes from pottery, because they would put imagery on the pottery. So you see women here doing things. We see women weaving cloth. That's what they're doing here, some type of a loom, it looks like. This artistic vase, which was new. This new type of vase in this after the Dark Ages was new. It was very artistic, very stylized, had all kinds of designs, shows the role and place of women. And this shows, in this time period, the role and place of women was at home doing women's work, in this case, weaving cloth. Very significant, important. But yeah, a lot of what we know about the Greeks comes from their pottery. These vases are incredible, and they tell us so much about their culture that because there was not a lot of writing yet. Here we have another piece of pottery here with men, competition. Again, nudity. Nudity was a common thing. Like the Olympics. The Olympics begins somewhere in this time period with the Greeks. The men all competed naked. The human body was not something anyone was ever ashamed of, really, until modern times. Nudity was just a normal part of life. It's really changed a lot in modern times, but for most of human history, going without clothes, if there was a reason for it, you would do it. If it was really hot outside and you weren't worried about getting sunburn, take your clothes off. It wasn't a big deal. It just was a common thing. Yeah. This is athletic competition based, demonstrates what Greeks held important, running and racing for men. Because why is running and racing so important? Those are martial abilities. Martial meaning war type abilities. In a war, you have to have good cardiovascular. You have to be able to run. You have to be able to fight. You have to be able to move quickly. So much of what the early Olympics was basically just men competing in martial skills, wrestling, running, these type of activities which would directly correlate to battle and warfare. Fighting others, wrestling others, stabbing and running, all this kind of stuff. So this is all part of the arete, individual excellence over others. Yeah, this is probably the most common type of art we find in early Greece, and in some cases the only art we find in early Greece, which tells us a lot about their society. It's quite interesting. It's very pretty, very, very pretty. All right, next section we'll talk about is Homer, Hesiod, and divide justice in Greek myth. So we're going to talk a little bit more about religion here. Greek religion and myth is really all blended together. Their religion is really derived from their myths. Their myths are really where their religious belief comes from. All right, they believed in divine justice. They believed you had to cooperate and compete simultaneously. Cooperate for a common goal, but also, in that cooperation, you still had to prove who was the best. Who was the star? Who was the strongest, the most powerful, the fastest? Who could rise to authority as a war leader? Things like this. So it was an odd blending of competition and cooperation, even between different city-states, even between different Greek peoples. They would compete this year and go to war over some land or territory, and next year they would cooperate to fight another third enemy, a different enemy. It's whatever the need arose. So the enemy today is my ally tomorrow, and vice versa. Common among Greeks. I guess the idea was you should never hold a grudge, because the guy who stabbed you in the back today, you might need him tomorrow to help you stab someone else in the back. And the Greeks understood this. Greek myths are where they learned a lot of their knowledge from, and their ideas, these myths, these stories which were held down and passed down for many years, for generations, even when there wasn't any writing. The myths often described the activities of the gods and goddesses, talked about their relations with humans, how the gods and goddesses dealt with humans, and basically the gods taught us all of our lessons. Again, the gods and society was really their religious belief, and that's where the values came from. The values of being a Greek, pretty much everything you did would be reflected from some type of god. So, if you wanted to be an honorable or just person, you would emulate a particular god, or if you wanted to be a warrior, you'd emulate another type of god. If you wanted to be a scholar, you would emulate another type of god. So, it's almost like whatever profession you chose, you had to choose the certain gods that applied to that profession, just to make it pretty utilitarian. But it really was that way. The idea of religion in Greek society was really a business. It was part of their culture. It was part of day-to-day functions of their society. It wasn't about prayer, wasn't about scripture. There really was no religious writings. There was really nothing we would call scripture for the Greeks. Nothing like that existed. Really interesting. They believed the entire world was under the control of the gods, and of course you can never really know what the gods want, so you spend your life trying to understand the gods and trying to adapt to whatever your current understanding of the gods is, or your society's understanding of the gods. Really interesting. Homer. Who is Homer? We're not sure Homer was even a real person. Homer was a poet, a blind poet, supposedly. But some historians now, or whoever it is that studies this, historians or literary historians or whatnot, some suggest that Homer might actually be just an amalgamation of multiple poets. Basically, multiple different stories put together. Or Homer might be the person who put them all together. Homer might be like an editor. Basically, the person that took a bunch of different stories and different myths and different, because most of what we see that Homer wrote down on paper occurred centuries before he ever lived. Most of it occurred well back before the Dark Age. So these are things that occurred hundreds of years ago. And these are stories that were passed down. So Homer might not have been a real person. Homer might have simply been someone who put all these myths down. Or Homer might be a combination of people. We're not really sure. But yeah, Homer might not be a real person, but it doesn't matter. The stories he wrote down, or the stories we have, are what matters. Homer's poems, he was really a poet, really talk about how gods interact with humans, the gods' plans for humans, what gods think about humans. Gods, which is also interesting, God's actions often weren't just or logical or even understandable at times. Guess what? That's humans. Humans often do things that are illogical, confusing, unfair. People lie, cheat, and steal. The reality is, the gods were perfect mirrors of human society. Gods could be petty, jealous, mean, vindictive, but they could also be courageous and brave and honorable. Literally every aspect of human society, you could find gods that were like this. Or even the same god, which, might change personalities. The gods were the perfect answer. Basically, it explained all of human interactions. They simply said, well, that's the way it is because that's the way the gods do it. And so this becomes a question of what came first, the chicken or the egg, that kind of stuff. Did humans simply create the gods to justify all of their actions? Some argue that that's really where the Greek gods really come out of, is the Greeks creating the gods in their image to justify all the different Greek actions of jealousy, anger, hatred, but also love and honor and bravery and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Yeah. So let's see. Hesiod was a little bit different. Hesiod emphasized justice, believing justice above all. This was another poet. Hesiod believed justice above everything. Justice was the most powerful force in the universe, and that pretty much everything will work out in the end justly. Equality and justice for all. Yeah. That's really the idea of equality and justice for all. By the way, if you're not aware, Western civilization, so much of what we have in our culture today, if you're not really getting that, if you haven't got it yet, you're going to get it. All of it comes from this. We can trace almost all aspects of American society, European society, which we're descended from European society. We can trace almost all of it to aspects of Roman and Greek culture. Hesiod was a justice and equality for all. A term in America, a term we use here in our modern government, in our modern political institutions, equality and justice for all. So, yeah, nothing we have today is new. We pretty much have used it, emulated, borrowed everything in our modern Western civilization from Greek and Roman culture and other things. So let's see. Ultimately, everything will work out in the end. There's actually almost an aspect of karma in Hesiod as well. Justice will eventually win out. Meaning, if you do bad things, eventually it will come around to you. Which is the idea of karma, right? It's the idea of karma, which is a Buddhist, Hindu, Indian tradition. It's the idea of karma. Well, that's sort of what Hesiod is saying. Interesting. You'll get what you deserve. That kind of stuff. And believing that all societies should be governed that way by equality and justice. Everybody being fair and treated the same. Hesiod also carried messages about existence, that the gods, that all existence is full of struggle, sorrow, and violence, just like human life. Basically, life is a constant struggle. So it isn't, and this also sort of could be thought of as the idea of it's not the destination that matters, it's the journey. When the final destination of Greeks was death. That was it. There was no afterlife, just death. That was it. Yeah, there's sort of this like purgatory, weird like otherworld thing, which I'm not going to really get into. But as far as like an afterlife of the Egyptians or an afterlife of the Christian idea, none of that existed for the Greeks. Generally speaking, death was just the end. There was nothing to look forward to in death. All that mattered is the honor and glory you could achieve while alive. Your arete while alive. Once you were dead, that's basically the end of the story. You're a shadow of your former self. You're like a ghost or something, living forever in the shadow world. So do everything, be everything you can. It's the journey that matters. The end doesn't even matter because the end is just the end. Quite interesting stuff. Now, Hesiod wrote this Theogony. Do I have it on here? Let's see if I have it. Yes, he wrote Theogony. Theogony is probably our greatest. It probably is our greatest store of knowledge about the gods. Theogony is the genealogy of the gods. It's literally the entire history of the Greek gods. The most knowledge we have, the single greatest repository of knowledge about Greek gods we have, is Theogony. He describes the birth of the gods, the union of chaos and earth, the primeval. It's funny, I actually saw there was a movie on TV recently which actually refers to this, which is sort of about this. If you've seen the movie The Wrath of the Titans, which I saw was on not too long ago, I think there was one or maybe even two of those movies. It's all about this. It's all about the Greek gods, the birth of the gods, the Titans, and the primevals, and the whole inspiration for those movies probably comes out of Theogony. His poems give justice very important, stresses the priority of the gods, especially Juice? I think that's what they used to call OJ back in the 70s, was it? The Juice or something like that? No, how about Zeus? Yes, Zeus, who was the ultimate justice. Zeus was the father of the gods, responsible for all justice, ultimately. Hesiod also felt that social elites who failed to live up to justice and fair treatment caused tensions and caused problems, and didn't really believe in the power of social elites, which is odd because I don't know this, but Hesiod was probably a social elite. He was probably one of the elite. Talking about how there shouldn't be elites. You see that now and then. I don't know if Hesiod was one that gave up all of his worldly possessions and walked the streets like a beggar. Maybe he did. Probably not, but maybe he did. Feeling that commoners deserve fair treatment, really encourages a movement towards a new form of political organization, known as democracy. Hesiod is incredibly significant in the creation of the first democracy. Really the only democracy in early world history, pretty much. And this is not a democracy like today. It is a different form of democracy, but it influences our democracy today. It certainly does. All right, the creation of the Greek city-state in the Archaic Age. We divide Greek history up into multiple ages, and this first one is the Archaic Age, not the Dark Age. We won't call it the Dark Age, because the Dark Age was the Dark Age. Nothing happened, at least nothing we know about. It was Dark Ages. But once Greeks recover civilization, recover culture and language, then we move into these ages. There's three of them. And we'll start with the Archaic Age first. From 750 to 500. This is the Archaic Age. We start to see a new type of city-state develop. We call the polis. And as it is in this type of language, you take away the S for the plural. So the plural is poli. So these are the new city-states we call the polis. It's different than previous city-states because many Greeks valued the idea of justice and political equality. To a point. No such thing existed as full equality to any degree. Don't even begin to think that. But for ancient human history, early human history, the type of equality that appears in the Greeks is different and ahead of and more advanced than anyone in the world. The closest thing we get to any type of equality in all of early human history, the Greeks probably achieve it, at least for a while. Of course, it's limited. We'll talk about that. Greeks used citizen as their defining characteristic. Pretty much citizens were only male free citizens. And there's our first thing, of course. Females were left out. But it also left out foreigners, immigrants, slaves, even naturalized people. Even people that were from other places and lived in Greece. No, you had to basically be a natural-born free citizen, which was only a small percentage of the population, actually. In some city-states, maybe only 20% of the actual population was male-free. So it's political equality for all. Men who are free and independent. It's still way ahead of anywhere else. The political systems, different city-states varied. But generally speaking, even though there's different political organizations in different city-states, and we'll talk about a couple of them, generally speaking, this was all a form of democracy, to where pretty much in every city-state, even with different varieties, the citizens actually played a role in making the laws and governing society, to varying degrees. That had never existed anywhere before. And truthfully, after Greece is eventually collapsed and the Romans take over, we really don't see that again, really, until modern times. So for like 2,000 years, we really don't see again this closest thing, again, we call it democracy, to having the actual citizens taking an active role in governing the state. All varieties of Greek culture allowed that to some degree, in different degrees. This also implied making laws as well, to where citizens would actually be involved in making laws. That never happened anywhere before or after. The kings made the laws, the elite made the laws, the priests made the laws. The idea of common, regular people making laws that governed all of society? What? And yet the Greeks did it, to different varying degrees. The Greeks all shared pretty much a common language, a common religion, yet they were still heavily divided. There's always this issue of competition and political division, and always this issue of arete, we're always in competition. So even though the Greeks shared a common culture, they were still divided, politically and simply geographically. The Greeks were across multiple continents. We had Greeks in Africa, Europe, and Asia. Further, there were dozens and dozens of islands we had Greeks on. So we had Greek colonies stretching, as far as like straight line stretching, for thousands of miles. So they were incredibly divided in so many ways. But what might even make that more interesting and more spectacular is, even though they were divided so far, they managed to generally maintain a common culture, even though the farthest Greek city-states might have been separated by thousands of miles. As travel would go, not as a crow flies, but as like travel would go around the sea and whatnot. They never became a single unified nation. Never happened, not in Greek time period. Eventually they do, well, not even then completely, but eventually Alexander sort of unites them. But Alexander wasn't even Greek. Alexander was, oh hell, I've gone blank now, but he was from up north. He was totally different. He wasn't even Greek, actually. Okay, let's see. Pretty much they always stay a group of independent poli, all across the Mediterranean and further. Geographic characteristics also restricted large-scale agriculture. Again, much of the Greek lands was rocky, mountainous, arid, especially the mountainous regions, very arid. So this also limited the size of their populations, but it really caused them to explore and colonize. Because they couldn't get what they needed right here, they had to constantly go looking around for what they needed, which is one of the reasons the Greeks stretched all across 3 different continents, across multiple seas, rivers, hitting a couple of different oceans. The reason the Greeks did that is because they were constantly looking for all of the resources they didn't have back home. And then you add to that their spirit of competition and aggression and their new warfare technologies that they learned. It's not surprising what we really see. So agriculture was really tough, and so a shortage of resources led them to go and explore and colonize, looking for land and resources. The most plentiful resource the Greeks probably had, though, was wood. Lots and lots of wood. Got wood? They had wood. Lots of wood. Which, of course, they used that wood to build ships. Ships and lots of ships. Which was perfect for them, because they were entirely surrounded by water, lots of rivers and oceans and seas, so it was perfect for them to take all those wood, chop down all those trees, make all those boats, and literally sail all across the Mediterranean and the connecting rivers and to colonize. It really worked out well for them. They also had large deposits of metal ore, which once they learned how to make iron, they were able to make iron and weapons, clay for pottery, for sculpture, and of course, with all the mountainous regions, they had masses of stone, so they used stone to build walls, to build structures, to build statues, to build all kinds of things. One of the most notable things about Greek culture is their architecture. They built massive architectural projects because they practically lived on a giant stone mountain. That was like almost the entire peninsula of Greece was stone. And it was readily accessible. So they used that stone to build impressive works of art and architecture and sculpture and buildings and all kinds of things. Not surprising. Food, they had barley, wine, and olives were probably three of the most common agricultural products used for everything. So between barley, wine, and olives, they could do everything with that. Between making food, between making bread, between making wine and spices and just a variety of foods. Probably they could make almost anything between barley, wine, and grapes, and olives. They could do almost anything. They raised pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens, cattle, and horses. So this gives you an idea of what they lived and how they ate. So grapes and wine and olives, barley. What do you call it? Say the Mediterranean diet. I could use a little bit of that probably. Pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, horses and cattle. Not a lot because you need broad like pastures. They didn't have a lot of those. If they had any broad pastures, it would probably turn into farmland. And the next age, or the next area, sometimes known as the Age of Colonization. This next period, 800 to 500, where they went and colonized, the world, if you will. The old world, anyway. Of course, the geography of Greece made sea travel very convenient. Lots of risk of storms and pirates, but that didn't stop the Greeks. The search for land, the search for resources, caused the Greeks to constantly search, expand, look for new land, new places to colonize, new places to put farmland. They weren't alone, though. You better understand, the Mediterranean bordered many different peoples. Many cultures and peoples had connections to the Mediterranean. So they often ran into many other people. Many other peoples that would establish colonies and lands all across the Mediterranean, which was perfect for the Greeks because they were always looking for a fight, always looking for competition, always looking for challenges. To prove their mettle, if you will. So always looking for that. So lots of other people established settlements, sometimes with the Greeks, actually with them, in combination with them. Mixed settlements. We see the Greeks doing this sometimes. We see lots of cities along the Mediterranean outside of Greece, especially along northern Africa, that are mixed cultures. We have Greek culture mixed with Egyptian culture in some cities along northern Africa. To where maybe they lived in peace. They lived together in peace. Maybe. Greek merchants often remained abroad for long periods of time. They often would establish permanent settlements, spread the culture. We see Greek culture exported all across Afro-Eurasia, more than any other culture at the time. We find evidence of Greek culture across northern Africa, Western Asia, Europe, all across the Mediterranean. It was the most extensively moved or most extensively influential culture in this time period, probably anywhere in the world. No other culture so extensively affected 3 different continents simultaneously. And it was just an issue caused by colonization, because the Greeks went everywhere, looking for land, looking for resources, looking for farmland, looking for new trade routes. Trade was a major income generator for Greece. We'll talk about Athens here in a little bit. The number one income of Athens, their number one revenue, came from trade. So they were always looking for new ports of trade, looking for new goods to trade, new products to trade, both import and export. Huge money. And again, Athens, it was their source of wealth, came from trade. And Athens at one point was the most powerful Greek city-state, and even empire for a while. 580 BC, Greeks had settled in Spain, France, Italy, Sicily, Africa, Asia, the Black Sea, and other places. Now, I use some of those names I just said. Those countries didn't exist. Don't be confused. There was no Italy. There was no France or Spain. But I'm just giving you that was the geographic region. You know, there was no countries back then. But those geographic regions, pretty much all across Europe, Northern Africa, into the Middle East, up into the Black Sea, into the Red Sea. There's even some evidence that some Greeks might have actually traveled as far as India via water. Quite interesting stuff. Cultural expansion and trade, new settlements in the Mediterranean and beyond. All right, so here we have an excellent map of the region. You have the Greek peninsula right here. Remember, this is a peninsula. It's not an island. Very rocky, very mountainous. Here we have Ionia, which this is Asia Minor. Into the Black Sea, all around the Black Sea. This is getting up into Central Europe. I mean, this is Russia. What is Russia today? Getting up into there. Mediterranean, or the Mesopotamia here. Egypt here. You have Greek cities. This is in Egypt, basically. Here we have Greek territories. This is Phoenician territories, which the Greeks simultaneously traded with the Phoenicians and warred with the Phoenicians. They were at war and trade partners, depending on where you were, depending on what settlement you were at. They could be at war with one settlement, and 50 miles away they could have a business dealings with another settlement. Just all depending on what the need arose. Greeks traveled across the Mediterranean. We know they actually traveled outside of the Strait of Gibraltar. There's evidence of the Greeks colonizing all the way up here into what is the Iberian Peninsula, or what is modern-day Spain and Portugal. So yeah, down the coast of Africa. Anywhere the Greeks could get a boat to where they think that they could make some money, they went. They expanded a lot. Went all over the place. And you can see some other cultures which we are going to talk about soon. The Carthaginians, although that may be a couple chapters before we get to them, those are the ones that went against the Romans. And of course, the Romans really began with the Etruscans. The Etruscans were their overlords, their kings for 200 years before the Romans overthrew them and established their empire, or the republic, I should say. Let's see. You can always come back to this map if you want to see something on it. Let's see what I want to go to next. Citizenship and freedom in the Greek city-states. Alrighty. Alright. The Greek city-state was unique because it was based on this concept of citizenship for all free inhabitants, which generally was only 1/3 to 1/4 of the population. Because even though a lot of women were free, didn't include women. So it only included... I need to make it a little more clear. Free women did have some rights. But as far as those that were able to participate in government, it was only the free men. Free women had some rights. But only the free men actually really are the ones that contributed to the democracy, if you will. This idea of citizenship for free, they rejected monarchy, they rejected the idea of kings. Most Greek city-states didn't have a king, for instance. The idea of justice was responsible for everybody. The idea of everybody had responsibility for justice as well, that everybody should work towards justice and equality. Sounds really great on paper. We look at America today and say America is supposed to be free and equal for all people, and we know the reality is it isn't. The reality is not the same as, the tagline. It's not. It's much better than it was. America is improving, as you want to compare it to where we were 100 or 200 years ago, but still, America has a lot of room for improvement before we really have equality and justice for all. We all know that. Well, the Greeks were obviously much further away from that. The women didn't have authority. It was just the free men, generally freeborn. Greek city-states were officially religious, meaning religion was official, but religion played honestly, religion was closer to like a governmental regulations than what we think of as religion. Religion played heavily into how the government worked. Very interesting. Lots of gods. You had to worship the gods. A lot of the different city-states worship particular god. Athens. Of course, Athens' protector was Athena, the goddess Athena. She was a goddess of wisdom. Corinth worshipped the goddess Poseidon. Now, that is a city god. Religion was really a state religion. But no close observance was required. You never had to go to the temples. On the holy days, you had no real responsibilities other than maybe eating a lot and drinking a lot, which the Greeks liked to do. So, yeah, religion was probably more closely tied to government and politics than it certainly is in modern, at least modern Western civilization. The Greeks believed in religious reciprocity. Religious reciprocity. In other words, if the humans honor the gods, you thank the gods for blessings, you will receive blessings in return. So basically, you honor the gods, you give your donations to the gods, you make your sacrifices, you do your rituals to the gods, or the priests do that. The gods will return a favor. The gods will hook you up. Pardon me. The Greeks also believed if the gods were offended, that the gods would basically dump shit on you. Literally, they would drop the world on you and kill you. They'd punish you, disasters, floods, famines, earthquakes, diseases, defeats in battle, hell, getting struck by a lightning bolt. Didn't matter. You kiss the gods' ass, the gods would reward you. You piss the gods off, and the gods would destroy you. Religious reciprocity. Greeks often avoided acts that would violate oaths. They tried to avoid breaking laws. They tried to always honor their word. They really believed that if they broke the commandments of whatever god they believed in, and there were lots of gods, but again, most people usually focused on one or a couple, they believed the gods would pay them back. Sort of this issue of karma, this issue of this karma, as I talked about with Hesiod. They even believed that being around someone who had angered the gods could be damaging. Almost like it would bleed off of them and could hurt you. Like they had an aura of evil or badness about them. Another thing which really made people obey the rules then. Because if you lived in a community and everybody was community, everybody knew everybody in their neighborhoods and their towns and villages. If one person is misbehaving and disobeying the gods and breaking the gods' commandments and rules and authority, that person could actually curse the entire village. So we have this peer pressure to obey the rules, which makes even further this requirement or this necessity to obey the gods' rules. Which, of course, are rules that we created, because, we're the ones that created the rules of the gods. So, interesting. Religious practices often centered on community rituals, often centered on sacrifices, not human sacrifices, but they did lots of animal sacrifices. They believed in sacrificing animals, burning things, cutting animals open to look at their insides, to thinking that was one of the ways the gods communicated with us. Religious festivals religion was really tied up in the actual governing of the city-state. The religious festivals weren't there for the people. The religious festivals were there to keep the gods happy. Don't get me wrong, the festivals made the people happy too. So maybe the festivals actually were for the people. Nonetheless, supposedly the festivals were there to keep the gods happy so the gods didn't get angry. To organize politics, Greeks really devised this idea of citizenship, this idea of democracy and political rights. Greek citizenship meant equal treatment under the laws, although women did have fewer rights than men. All free adult males could vote in assemblies. Let's see if I have it on here. Pretty much, yeah, ignore that. That's why I have a line through it, so you can ignore that. Free adult males in most of the city-states could actually participate in government assemblies, which would make the laws, make the doctrines, the decisions. They did believe in this version of egalitarianism, which is equality of some sort, but still generally it only applied to male citizens. Although women were still treated pretty decently. If you were a female citizen, you didn't have the rights a man did, but you still had more rights than most women in early societies. You could own property, you could own your own business. Again, very few societies allow women to own property or inherit land. You could in Greek society, potentially. The degree of power sharing, though, varied greatly. Okay, I'm still basically on political rights and democracy, so I'm not to slaves and women yet. So the degree of power sharing varies greatly. Some city-states were ruled by a tyrant, some by oligarchs, and some by direct democracy. The difference, a tyrant is usually one person or one family that rules, and usually that family chooses one person. You might think it's like a king. It's not exactly. The family was supposed to rule with the best interests of the people in mind. And this actually worked out. You might say, oh, well, it isn't really going to work out that way. It actually did. Because the Greek people had this real inherent idea of equality and citizenship, at least among the men. And if the family and the particular tyrant, which was usually the eldest male, did not rule appropriately, they'd take him out. I mean, there's multiple stories where they literally just killed off the whole family. Just killed them. That's how you get tyrants out of power. You kill them. Or they would sometimes force them to step down. They would force, almost like an elected position, almost like a president, they would force them to step down. Probably at threat of death, probably. So even a tyrant, today in modern vernacular, a tyrant is usually a really bad thing. Totalitarian dictator kind of thing. It wasn't like that in Greek. Don't be wrong, that did probably happen occasionally, but generally speaking, the tyrant wasn't bad. There also could be an oligarch, which is an elite group of people, like elected or chosen leaders, probably numbering under 100. And this elected elite, which were probably chosen from the freemen, they ruled everybody. So you have this small group of elites which ruled society. Also, again, if they did not rule appropriately, they would probably be removed by force if necessary. Although they would probably be given the option to simply step down, like an elected position. And then, of course, you have simply democracies. A direct democracy. It's misleading. If you were a free citizen, say Athens, 25% was free males, all those men could vote and make laws. But to do it, you had to show up every day, every business day, however that was defined, and you had to vote. You had to stand around all day long, you had to discuss, you had to debate, you had to vote. And so generally any person, like if it was like today's society, imagine whenever Congress wanted to pass a law, we could actually show up at Congress and vote on that and decide whether we're going to pass that law or not. All you got to do is show up. How many of us are going to go march up to Washington and spend all day, every day, 5 days a week to vote? Wait, don't you have a job, a family, a life, school, etc., etc.? Yeah, same thing back then. Most free citizens were still farmers. Could they just bail on their farm and spend all week in town voting on laws? Even though legally they could, they didn't. I mean, realistically, you couldn't. Who's going to run your farm, right? Who's going to take care of your farm and milk the cows and plant the wheat, etc.? So even though it was a direct democracy, which literally every single free man could vote on every law, most didn't. Which means you were left with a society that was generally ruled by a couple hundred or a couple thousand wealthy people, wealthy men. Because they're the only ones who could afford to stand there every single day making laws, because they could afford to have servants or slaves or whatever doing the work on the farm and running their home and running their business. So you ultimately end up in a society where everybody can vote, but only like 10% actually do, because only 10% are able to do it. So even the direct democracy is a little misleading. The truth is, the majority of people probably didn't participate directly, because they simply weren't able to do it. All right, and then we move to slaves and women. Slavery grew dramatically in Greek society in the colonization age. As a direct consequence of them colonizing and going all over the place, they ran into lots of other peoples, which gave them opportunities to buy a lot of slaves. And they did. Greek society had a lot of slaves. Athens probably was 20-30%. Entire population was probably slaves. Lots of slaves. It's really odd if you think about it. It was the most democratic state, and yet it also may have had more slaves than anyone, well, maybe except for Sparta, had lots and lots of slaves. Well, that was a consequence of all of their trade activities. One of the number one commodities to trade through most of human history has been slaves. Again, nothing to do with race, nothing to do with gender. It's simply the stronger overcoming the weaker and enslaving them. Or there's other reasons, as I mentioned before. Slaves were excluded from citizenship, of course. Slaves were owned by the individuals, but slaves were also owned by the state. The city-states themselves, the government owned thousands of slaves. They used the slaves to do all the building projects. I mean, yes, they would also hire people, but generally the people that were hired were the skilled workers. You know, like think on a construction site, like a skilled contractor is doing the electrical or plumbing. That's a very skilled job. But then more of a common job, just a person who's just nailing in, just building a wall, is a lot less of a skilled job. Just a basic carpenter is something you can teach someone in a short period of time, while more specialized skills are not. Same thing here. The more specialized skills would be free citizens, commoners or whatnot, and then the more labor-intensive ditch digging and things like this, labor-carrying things would often be done by slaves. So these Greek city-states built all kinds of structures, walls and monuments and all kinds of things. Well, a lot of that was built with slave labor. A lot of it was. Slavery wasn't permanent. You could actually buy your way out of slavery, work your way out of slavery. It was a status symbol if you were a person who could free slaves, like as a status. Like you were a wealthy person, you could afford to buy slaves, have them work for you a while, and then free them. That was a status symbol because you got credit for that among your society. Hey, I freed 5 slaves. I've given 5 slaves freedom and equality of some sort. It's a status thing. It really was. Plus, they're also beholden to you now. Even though they're not technically a slave, if you call on them and ask them to help you or assist you with something, guess what? They're going to come and help you. They're expected to. So they're almost like a tributary now to you, or there's another word a vassal. They're like a vassal to you. They're free, but if you call, they're supposed to come running to help. So they owe you because you gave them freedom. So you could become free. You would never become a citizen though, and you would never be able to really vote. There's also no evidence. There's actually no evidence in Greek society of anyone ever really calling to abolish slavery. Slavery was so common in Greek society, as it was in all societies, it was just accepted. There's always going to be slaves. Slaves were treated as property, so you could do whatever you wanted with them. They were yours to do what you wanted with. And that does include physical abuse and sexual abuse. You could do whatever you wanted with them. Women took care of the household, which allowed men to do all the other stuff. It allowed men to go and do the duties, to be in the military, to be in politics, to do the farming, while the women took care of the household duties, managing the household, including income and money. Because a lot of people were in businesses out of their homes, small businesses. So they managed the businesses at home as well. So women actually had a significant role in the financial aspect of Greek culture. We do know that women were involved in religion to some degree. We do have a handful of women that were priestesses. Religion was primarily a male duty and male responsibility, but we know women did get involved as well, which could possibly give them some freedom of movement or status, because religion was such held in high regard. If you became a priestess of some sort, you would actually elevate your status. You could be held in high regard as well. Generally speaking, women had more rights than most of the ancient world in Greek society, due to their idea of equality and citizenship. They were not equal to free men, but more equal than women in most cultures. Marriages were arranged. Women were married in the early teens. And women did actually have a right to divorce in the right circumstances. There's records of women getting divorces for being abused by their husbands, or their husbands cheating on them. It's really ironic. A man could go have sex with another man and it would be okay, but have sex with another woman and you could potentially lose your life, lose your family potentially over it. So there was some interesting rules with regarding who you could have sex with, which I'm not getting into at the moment. But the Greeks had some odd ideas about sex. Not all the city-states did, but many of them had some odd ideas. Households were nuclear, what we call a nuclear family, which means husband, wife, and kids. Men could have sex with anyone, as I said, as long as it wasn't another free woman. Generally, free women were off limits, but they could have sex with prostitutes, they could have sex with kids, they could have sex with men, didn't matter. There was no free or slave didn't matter either, really. Well, other than free women was dangerous. Free women was risky. But yeah, there was some risks there. Let's see what is next. Marriage in the home. I talked about that. Here we have a woman at an altar. This was on a drinking cup. Beautiful art. Really, it's really very, very detailed, very pretty. This displays one of the few public roles a woman could have, which could be as a priestess of some sort or religious observance. Most roles for women were private, in the private sphere, which is a modern terminology. The public sphere was incredibly off limits. If you saw just a woman walking alone on a street somewhere in a common area, odds are she was either very young, in other words, she was young enough that she hadn't had a family yet, or she was a prostitute. Most common people you saw on the streets, or slave, if you're a slave woman, of course, proper women didn't just go walking around unescorted on the street. But this is one of those few public roles women might have. This is one of the few ways women would have any type of power or authority, religion and ritual, which might have been one of the most important aspects of Greek culture. Religion and ritual, of course. Just don't confuse it with our idea of modern religion. It's a totally different thing. She's making a sacrifice here. That could be blood, it could be wine. And she's pouring it on a fire, a ritual fire. The idea is this is to make a sacrifice to the gods. Again, they didn't kill humans, but they did slaughter a lot of animals for sacrifices to the gods, or cut them open and look at their insides to see if the gods were giving us messages through that. Interesting stuff. Here we have a Greek hoplite. I haven't really mentioned hoplites. This was the Greek soldier, your typical Greek soldier. He's holding a spear in his hand, and he would have had a shield too. It's not in the image. And they wore very little clothes. They wore very little clothes back then, or hardly anything at all. He's got some type of a head covering on. He's got a spear, and then he would have also had a shield as well. This hoplite soldier. And this is what a male was supposed to look like. This is a Greek architecture. This is well, it's part of architecture, but it's okay. It's a sculpture, I guess we'll call it, or because technically it's a frieze, maybe, or a God. There's even another word for it. Anyway, you get the idea. Forget all his names. You get the idea of what a perfect male is supposed to look like. Tall, muscular. I mean, the dude's got a six-pack, right? Look at his thighs. Looks like he could lift an ox. This is what a male warrior is supposed to look like. Now, a lot of them probably did actually look like this. I mean, you can't talk about height, but as far as actual body, the build, and the musculature, in many Greek societies, the men trained from boys to be warriors. They would train for years to be warriors. It was very, very important. Martial prowess, as I mentioned before, that was your arete, your ability to fight and be strong and brave and courageous and fight to the death. There was a common saying, and I don't know where it comes from, but it's probably in some poetry, where the Greek soldiers went off to fight, and the wife says to her husband, come back carrying your shield or on it. In other words, either come back victorious or that you died trying. The only two options. Either win or die trying. That's it. And that really says a lot about Greek culture. It was all or nothing. It's all or nothing. There is no place for compromise or second place. This is one of the things that made the Greeks so successful. Their drive, their ambition. It's also one of the things that made them weak. Because they were so aggressive. They were sometimes, what's the phrase they say? Discretion's a better part of valor. Sometimes knowing when to not do something is just as important as knowing when to do something. Greeks weren't like that. Most of the Greeks were like, do, and then ask questions later, which doesn't always work. So it was maybe their greatest weakness and their greatest strength in general about the Greeks. Quite interesting. Proud and powerful, great fitness and posture. This was the now. Don't get me wrong. This imagery is idealized. It's what's the ideal, the perfect Greek. But I'm just saying, for your typical warrior, it was probably pretty typical because they were expected to train constantly and be ready for combat. So, they probably were in pretty good shape most of the time, ready to fight. Here we have a vase. This is, I guess, the side of a vase, or, well, what's left of this piece of vase. Lots of broken pieces, probably been put back together. As you can see, all the different lines. This is actually a job you can get if you want to get into museum work or restoration. You can spend the rest of your life just putting together pieces of broken vases in museum back rooms. It's a job you can do. Actually seems like pretty cool, pretty fun. It's a puzzle. Putting the pieces back together, you can see the woman getting cleaned and oiled here and anointed. She's getting ready to be married. It's a purification process to make sure she's pure in both body and soul. One of the reasons in human history we see girls often being married so young. In early human history, it is not uncommon for girls to be married off at 11, 12 years old, even younger. Because having a pure bride was maybe the most important thing. Because bloodlines and inheritance was everything. Honor was everything. So the last thing you would ever want is to marry like a 15 or 16-year-old girl that was no longer a virgin, who had already lost her virginity to some other man. No man would want her in most societies. It's not just the Greeks, most were like this. So if you had sex before marriage, you might probably never, ever get married. Unless you hid it or lied about it, if you were able to get away with that. Because no man would want you. There was such a high ideal, such a high value placed upon purity of women. Which this is really bad for women, actually. Because it caused women in all these different cultures to really be oppressed, discriminated against, have rights held back from them, to be kept sanctioned off from society, to not be allowed multiple opportunities all across early human society. And this still exists today because they have to be protected. That's a code word for also basically keeping them oppressed. It is. Anyway, so this is a great image here of how women are being treated that way, how she is being treated as such an important prize. This was one of women's duties, to be the proper wife and to take care of other women. This is the private sphere of women. Here we have there's probably some servants with her here, maybe members of the family. Hard to know, hard to tell. All right. New directions for the Greek city-states, 750 to 500, and we're going to go on and talk about Sparta and Athens as well. So what we're going to do here is pretty much a little brief summary of oligarchy and tyranny. Not going to spend a lot of time on this. Just going to go through it quickly. Sparta was ruled by an oligarch. Oligarchy. Small group, small number of men dominated all the assembly, policy making, and law making. The Spartan oligarchy had three components. There were two hereditary, very prestigious military leaders called kings. So they had two kings. They were both the generals and the head of the religion, the head of Sparta's religious authority and military. They had a council of 28 elders and 5 elected officials who were called ephors, and these were overseers who basically made and enforced the laws. So you have basically a group there of about 35 men who ruled their society. So that's an oligarchy, a small group of elites that have all the power. However, there was still some democracy. The common men could still do some voting and do some participation, and they could still have their voices heard. And as I mentioned, some of those officials I just mentioned were elected by the people. So there was still a significant role to be played by free citizens, even if the oligarchy could overrule the free citizens. They still had a say in it. So it's still a quasi kind of democracy. All free adult men were known as alike. All free adult men were known as alike, and they were part of the assembly, which could actually approve legislation. So even with this ruling of the oligarchy, still the free regular citizens had a word. Military readiness was most important. Military authority was most important. Everything else was secondary. The Spartan economy pretty much depended entirely on a large labor force of enslaved Greeks. This was known as Helots. The Helots were from neighboring regions. The largest, Messenia. Messenia was actually bigger than Sparta. And the Spartans, through military might, had enslaved pretty much the entire region. And they were the Helots. They were the slave force. So Sparta was mostly slaves. Most of the Spartan population were slaves from a neighboring region. By 700 BCE, the Helots outnumbered the Spartans, and as time went by, the Helots actually grew. By the fall of Sparta, the Helots outnumbered the Spartans almost 3-1. Constant fears of rebellion, constant fears of violence. Therefore, every single year, the Spartans actually declared war on the Helots. Purpose? So that the Spartans could kill the Helots at any time to appease the gods. Because you were able to kill an enemy anytime you wanted. If you're an enemy, I can attack you and kill you whenever, in the view of the gods. Therefore, the Spartans declared war on the Helots every single year, so that they could kill them with impunity, to basically keep down rebellions and not offend the gods. It's a way of doing it, I guess. It's a way of doing it. The Helots they were treated as inferior. They would be publicly humiliated. They were treated as slaves, even as animals almost. They treated the Helots bad. After all, your greatest enemy, your greatest threat was always your war enemy, whoever you're at war with. And under Spartan politics, they were at war 24/7, 365 with the Helots. Therefore, they could treat them however they wanted, anytime they wanted, all the time. They could kill them anytime they wanted. The Helots were a large non-military labor force, which allowed the male citizens to basically train full-time for war. The Helots did everything. The Helots took care of construction. They took care of all the duties. They took care of the farming, which allowed all the Spartan free males to basically train full-time as soldiers. Which also meant they were really, really good at fighting. So whenever the Helots did rebel, and the Helots did rebel at times, the Spartan soldiers would quickly gear up, and they would just go and slaughter masses. Thousands of Helots at one time. They just go on a slaughtering spree until the Helots begged for forgiveness. At age 7, boys would go off and train and live until age 30. So from 7 to 30, you trained as a warrior and you fought. So at 30, you'd retire and marry and start a family, if you had lived, if you managed to live that long. They trained from 7 to 15, so from 15 to 30, they fought. And if you managed to live, then you'd go off and start a family. Quite interesting. And this idea was that the boys would become loyal to his fellow soldiers as opposed to loyal to his family. And by the time you see his family again, you wouldn't even know his family. He didn't even know it, really. His loyalty was solely to the other boys, the other men, the other soldiers. Harsh conditions. This really forced on them courage, cunning, to disregard pain. They were practically tortured at times, the soldiers, so that they could they could basically endure any type of conditions of war. And if you couldn't, you would be disgraced and have your status as a Early removed. You wouldn't be a slave. You'd just be a common citizen or a common non-citizen, and you would not be one of the Early. Typically, older men would have relationships with young boys. This was common. These sexual relations. This was intended to create loyalty. The older man would teach the younger boy. So yes, it would be very common for an older man to take a younger boy as basically a sexual partner, would teach, would train, would be expected to help him grow and learn things, etc. That kind of stuff. Let's see. They were to be attached to each other, to work together and to care for each other emotionally and willing to die for each other. So, yeah. Different for what we're used to today. But the idea is you'll fight to the death for someone you love and care about emotionally more so than just some guy you are trained next to, just another soldier. You'll fight and be willing to die for someone who you feel emotions for, compassion for. Women were known for their liberty. Women were known for their independence in Sparta because the men were always gone. So women actually probably had more independence, liberty, and authority in Sparta than maybe any other society, any other Greek society. They were expected to bear healthy children, teach them to follow Spartan values. Women were also trained militarily. Women were also trained at a young age to fight before they married and had families, before they started having kids. So that if war ever came to a Spartan city or town, then the women could pick up the spears and the swords and they could fight as effectively as the men. To always be ready for war. All free citizens were always ready for war. Male or female, young or old, didn't matter. Sparta's population was never large. Eventually it gets to the point that at some point later in years, Spartans actually are required to marry wives and have multiple wives because it was, I guess, because they formed these relationships with other men. Some men never married. They just didn't because they were in love with other men as opposed to being in love with women. They'd spent their entire life up to age 30 with other men. Some just didn't. So eventually the laws were changed in Sparta, forcing the men to marry, even forcing them to, by the end, even marry 2 women. Because the Spartan population just died. Basically, they were just dying out. Between wars and the fact that their training, their whole situation, how they train for military, they started families so late that a lot of men never had families. They simply died before ever having kids. So they changed the rules a little bit as time goes on, out of necessity, because the Spartans are just doing so poorly. There's Sparta. This is Messenia over here. Messenia wasn't the only helots they had, the only slaves they had. They had others. But Messenia was one of the largest. Early on, Sparta conquered Messenia and enslaved their entire population. So yes, this is Greeks enslaving other Greeks. Yeah, not surprising. You also see Corinth, which I'm not really going to talk about Corinth. I was, but I can't really talk about Corinth. You'll see Olympia there, the home of the Olympic Games. That's where the Olympic Games began. And I don't see marathons on here. That's where the marathon began. People running from, I guess, Olympia to marathon. All right, I'm going to leave Corinth out. I should mention that. Ah, yes, the image of a Spartan youth. Again, as you can see, no issue with nudity. Nudity, the Spartan boys and girls trained in the nude. So the Spartan boys and girls trained in the gymnasium, they would call it. That's where we get the term gymnasium today. That was the training grounds. And of course, the term gym all comes from that. When they would train in the gymnasium, which is just the training yard, the training area, they would train naked, men and women. Although they would be separate, men and women would be trained separately. So the bronze, you can see the Eastern influences here. The lions. There weren't any lions in Greece. So we have the influence here of Eastern. Already talked to here. Here is supposedly a boy carrying 2 lions on his shoulders. That shows he's a badass mofo. After all, who else can conquer and carry around 2 lions on their shoulder? The idea here is how powerful he is, how strong he is, his idealized body here, that the muscles and the 6-pack or 12-pack, whatever the hell you want to call it, and the really strong shoulders and arms, because that's what mattered. In war, you needed to be skinny, because you needed to be light on your feet, agile, and fast. You needed to have incredible muscles in your legs for running and fighting, and you needed to have really strong arms for using weapons. So this is a really idealized youth. He has lions, saying he's powerful. His hair is also a status symbol. Long hair was a status of upper class people, while slaves always had short hair. So his hair is also a status that shows he's high status, warrior. Yeah. Very interesting. All right. We're going to Athens, yes. Talk about democracy in Athens. Democracy in the city-state of Athens from 632 to 500. In Athens, we see the greatest level of democracy in Greece. From around 800 to 700, the economy improved rapidly and the population expanded at a phenomenal rate. So from 8 to 700, Athens grew economically and culturally and population-wise. By the 7 and 600s, Athens became a leader among other city-states. We see a large middle class. We see them growing, expanding into farmland. This is one of the things, a lot of their wealth was based on trade, merchants. And so they had a lot of farmland in other places outside of Greece. Just so happens Athens as well is a relatively flat area. So Athens had the luck of having actually a lot of accessible farmland. It's on the eastern coast of Greece, which is a lot flatter. So Athens had a lot of natural farmland in the first place, which gave them a distinct advantage over others. But of course, necessity for seaborne trade, of course, allowed a lot of families to become rich and wealthy, prosperous. By the 7th century BC, Athens had created an assembly. We get an assembly where all free adult males help decide the affairs. They elected leaders of Athens, which were known as archons. This is that really free democracy I talked about, to where pretty much all male citizens, thousands of them, could vote. But who did? Of course, most can't. So most of the people doing the voting and lawmaking are more likely to be elites. But still, anyone who was a free citizen, or even just even an immigrant, could actually achieve a lot of status and wealth in Athens. It was really an interesting thing. A lot of the rich people in Athens weren't even citizens. They were actually foreign merchants and traders and business people that were making money off of overseas trade. That's actually a more and more common thing we'll see as we go along, to where oftentimes the foreigners are actually more prosperous than the locals because of trade, specifically trade. They elected these archons, even though they had this free assembly. The archons were the leaders. The archons were also the generals in times of war. Only elite people could be archons. They got no money. So as I said, they didn't get paid. So when they didn't get paid, the assembly, and plus the assembly met during the day, so most people couldn't participate in the assembly, and most people couldn't be archons. The assembly was for everyone. Of course, everyone couldn't participate, for reasons I've said, and the archons were only the elite. Around 621, we see a crisis in Athens, an economic crisis, and we have a new archon arise. His name is Draco. You may have heard the term draconian laws. This refers to Draco. What did Draco do? He created very harsh laws, even creating multiple laws for executions, sometimes for very minor crimes. Stuff that literally would only have been a fine before, now people could be executed for. Why did he do this? He did this, and why did the assembly approve it? The assembly approved it, who was primarily the elite upper class, because they feared a poor uprising. They were on harsh economic times. Basically, Athens entered a depression. And so they believed anytime this happens, there's always a fear of the poor uprising. We even see this today in modern times. Anytime there's a depression or recession, suddenly we're all worried about the poor and the impoverished and the minorities and the immigrants and the foreigners. We're always worried about that stuff. It's always us versus them, the fear of the other. When times are good, everybody's happy. But whenever times get stressful, everyone always looks for someone to go after, someone to attack, a scapegoat, someone to blame. It's the same shit we deal with today. It's always been this way. So they find people to blame, and they start punishing foreigners. They start punishing people for petty crimes. Therefore, we call these draconian laws. Laws that are far more harsh and violent than the crime is due. That's really due. By 600 BC, citizens were deeply in debt. Athens was in depression, pretty much a full depression. Even citizens were being sold into slavery. One of the other common reasons for slavery in world history is debt. You can't pay your bills. Today, you get a bad FICO score. Back then, you become a slave. Eventually, they put another archon in charge named Solon. Solon comes along and he changes everything. He does a lot of changes. He retracts a lot of Draco's laws and Draco's policies, and he actually fears a civil war. He actually believes Athens might actually crumble into an internal civil war that might bring down the entire city-state. Could have happened. He ends debt slavery. He frees enslaved people. He cancels debt. He doesn't give the land to the poor, though. He doesn't give everything to the poor, which is what a lot of people called for. Because most of the land was owned by the rich. Especially with all the people going into debt, losing their land. Who bought up all the land? The rich. So suddenly, the rich own everything. This we see actually happen multiple times in human history. Anyway, he doesn't do that. He doesn't take all the land away from the rich. because they're, he's one of the rich, and they're the ones that are supporting him, really. So he does reform politics. He does actually change the entire way government works in Athens. He really creates a much more democratic Athens. Initially, we had a direct democracy that few people participated in, for reasons I've discussed. Solon changes a lot of that. Solon divides society and actually makes a stratified society of everyone's in 4 groups based on wealth. He makes the top group entirely based on wealth and not birth, which is actually hugely significant. Meaning the only way you gain status in Athens is through your own work. You can't be born into status. In other words, family name doesn't matter anymore. You might think, well, the rich are still rich. Not exactly. By today's standards, look at the idea of an entrepreneur. Someone who starts poor or common and through their own blood, sweat, and tears becomes successful. In America, there's a term that's been used that you may have heard, known as the self-made man. In other words, the way Solon changes the law is if you are wealthy and powerful by birth, guess what? You just lost all that. You don't have any status now. The only way you get status is if you start at the bottom and work your way up through your own blood, sweat, and tears. Family name doesn't matter anymore. This actually makes a lot of people really happy, because suddenly he just took the entire upper echelon elite and knocked them down, and the only people who are elite now are people who actually worked hard, earned their money, earned their wealth and status. I'm sure it wasn't a perfect system, but it really makes it to where a lot of people are now willing to work harder and understand that there's actual real economic opportunity in Athens for the first time. It really changes a lot of people's views. Yes, you're still going to have wealthy elites, but now you have to earn your own money. You have to earn it yourself, which most elites don't. I mean, a lot of wealth is transferred by inheritance, simply the way it is. Anyway, he changes that. He also changes how you get office, your eligibility to be in office. You also can get status in office by working your way up through like a bureaucracy. Today we have a term called civil service. You work your way up the ladder through civil service, working for the government. You start at the bottom, you work your way to the top, and you have to do the whole step. It takes 20, 30 years. He creates something like that, to where you can have more power and authority by working your way up the economic ladder. So the more money you have, the more status you have, the more powerful you are. But you have to earn it yourself. Bottom rank is laborers, but now you have upward mobility. You can actually get a job, have a career, make money, save money, and actually gain status. And you could even, for the first time, buy your way into citizenship. Not through bribes, but literally through wealth. If you made enough money, you could actually become a citizen and be part of Athens' elite. Effectively making all free men citizens. Yeah, he creates a council, this big council, like 400 people. I'm not to that yet, so don't look at tyranny yet. I'm not quite to that point yet. I'm not going to back it up, though. But he creates a council of 400 men who would be voted into office. He makes another assembly. Eventually, that 400 gets expanded to 500. Yeah, he creates all kinds of court reforms, judicial reforms with legal cases. What he basically does, he creates in his lifetime, he takes a direct democracy and he turns it into, for a while, effectively a real democracy. To where people have paid positions now in government. You don't have to go and just stand around all day. You can actually go and get paid for voting, for participating. He creates the world's first participatory democracy. Now, it doesn't last that long. Matter of fact, I think it lasts a century. And then it sort of falls apart. But for this time, after Solon, we have a real a real closest thing to modern democracy we'll have. The closest thing to modern democracy we'll have for over 2,000 years. So after Solon's death, we had this brief period of tyranny which overtook Athens in the mid-500s. Many elites didn't like what he had done. That makes sense, right? You have elite people, they've lost status, they lost wealth, they've lost power. Suddenly they were here, and suddenly they're down here. And, it's what do wealthy and powerful people want? More than anything is more power, not less. So they lost all that. So we do see a little bit of chaos, a little bit of civil war ensue for a few years. Gets pretty violent. Actually gets so bad that some Athenians actually call in Sparta. That's the age-old enemy of Athens to come in, and Sparta actually comes in and keeps the peace and eventually overthrows the tyrants and restores order to Athens, and then leaves. That's really crazy. That'd be like us having a civil war in America and calling in Russia to come and save us. Nope, that wouldn't happen. Russia come over here, and they might put down the civil war, and then they'd probably take over the country, and we'd all be Russian. No, it wouldn't work that way. But that's what they did. Spartans come in, save them, everything. They put down the tyrants around 510 BCE. So, pretty interesting. Around 508, they elect Cleisthenes, we'll go with that, Cleisthenes. He becomes the father of Athenian democracy. He expands reforms that began under Solon, and he makes it he expands it, he makes it greater, more impressive. He increases the size of the council to the 500, like I said, and he actually creates a bunch of demes. Today, think of a comparison to like congressional districts. He creates a bunch of these congressional districts all across Athens, and to where every council member, or there's council members chosen that represent the size of the demes. It's exactly what we do today. We break up our congressional districts based on population and geography, and then we have representatives for each of those districts based on population. So, yeah. And so greater population areas have more representatives, and smaller areas have fewer. Quite interesting. He also spreads public office among all the people to where public office can now be held by anybody, even including people living out in the countryside. Simply put, the power base of Athens had always been the city itself, not all of the surrounding countryside and other towns and communities. Now, with all these demes spread across the entirety of Athens, their entire empire, it really redistributes the power out of the city, takes it out of a lot of the power out of the wealthy, and gives it to many people in farmlands and rural areas. Equal share of the power. It's not a perfect system, of course, but it's still pretty impressive. It really spreads the power base out. And makes it a lot more fair and just. All right. And it looks like the thing we will end with, the last thing we'll say, is new ways of thought and expression in Greece. This also won't. This is our last section. Shouldn't take a couple minutes. All right. So during the Archaic Age, intellectuals and artists began to expand into new ideas of art and literature. Much of it influenced by Near Eastern culture. We saw a statue a minute ago of that Spartan boy with lions on his shoulder. That's an influence of Eastern culture. We have paintings, we have sculptures, become more vivid, more realistic. We have poetry about love and emotion and war and death and sexuality. A lot of things that people didn't talk about. Because pretty much any type of writing was usually associated with the gods or religion or something or the state. Now we've got poetry about sex. We have poetry about love and jealousy and all this kind of stuff. That was different. That was new. We now see Greeks really expressing their emotions in art and literature and architecture. And we think music, although it's a little questionable, but we think music as well. They hadn't really done before. Sappho of Lesbos. Some people may have heard of Sappho. Sappho of Lesbos was famous for love poems, some of them quite erotic. Some of them pretty crude, actually. Look up some of her poetry. She's also the first female poet in Western civilization, really. Look up her, some really good stuff. For the time, it would have probably been considered pornographic. Let's see. Archilochus of Paros wrote about soldiers. He wrote about friends lost at sea and about love gone astray or awry, however you want to put it. Love gone bad. You know how country songs are. My girl done left me. My dog done died. My truck broken down. I mean, that's what Archilochus talked about. Talked about daily life and hardships and love and loss and soldiers and girl done left me. My dog done died. Yeah, quite interesting. Philosophy and science were very important as well. We don't spend a lot of time on this, which is too bad. We could spend a whole lecture talking about Greek philosophy, science, and whatnot. We see the pre-Socratics. What does that mean, a pre-Socratic? These are simply the philosophers that came around before Socrates. They were pre-Socrates, who was probably the greatest Greek philosopher. So pre-Socratics. So philosophy. So Socrates didn't come out of nowhere. He was really following a tradition of other philosophers, even if he became maybe the most well-known, perhaps. They devised new explanations of the human world, new ways of interacting with gods, new ways of how humans should deal with gods. Interesting stuff, really stuff. Let's see if I have a couple else. Do I have others on here? Oh, yeah, there we go. Pre-Socratics. We have Thales and Anaximander. Thales and Anaximander, they were from Ionia. Ionia, which is Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. They were from Ionia. They began to theorize about the universe based on laws of nature. These were the first scientists. They didn't use the term back then, of course, but these were the first scientists. They actually called it philosophy, but they called it natural philosophy. So it wasn't about philosophy of the mind or philosophy about social institutions. It was philosophy about nature, natural philosophy, which later we would call science. This was the beginning of scientific discovery and scientific research. They talked that they believed the entire universe was based on laws rather than being unpredictable. Simply put, most people thought the universe operated unpredictably like humans, because humans were like gods. Gods were unpredictable. Humans are unpredictable. And since the gods basically created the universe, the assumption was that since humans are unpredictable, gods are unpredictable, gods created and built the universe, and they controlled the universe, therefore the universe was incredibly unpredictable. Just one step to the next. Very logical, actually. Well, the logic of people like Thales, Anaximander, and others said simply that, no, the actual universe operated by laws, natural laws, and that the universe wasn't actually unpredictable, and that the universe didn't operate by the whims of the gods. The gods might be able to influence things. They didn't go so far as to discount the gods completely. They probably got themselves killed for doing something like that. But they went so far as to say the gods simply weren't as powerful as we think. That the gods actually have to follow some other type of rules of the universe. Just like we have to follow the rules of the gods are also having to follow the rules of something else. That there are some type of laws even the gods can't disobey. Believing the universe wasn't random, it wasn't arbitrary. They named it cosmos. This is where we get the term cosmos, meaning the idea of ordered and beautiful. Yeah. They really believed the universe operated by what modern scientists use the term laws. You've heard the term laws of science. They believed the universe operated by laws. Now, they didn't know what a lot of these laws were. It's not like they were back there, discovering gravity or any shit like that, but they believed the entire world operated on some type of system of natural laws. And they spent their lives trying to discern some of these systems. Pythagoras. Most people have heard of Pythagoras in your math class. The Pythagorean theorem. He believed numerical relationships explained everything. He believed the entire laws of the universe could be melted down into numbers. Physics, anybody? You ever taken physics? That's really what it is. Physics is really trying to understand how everything works, literally the laws of everything, using mathematics. I don't know that he's considered a physicist, the first physicist or anything, but effectively that's what he was. He was a mathematician for certain, but he really was trying to find a way to discern the laws of the universe through mathematics, which is pretty much what we do today. Pretty much what physicists do. Yeah. He really was probably the first high or thinker of high-level mathematics. Interestingly enough, in case you're unaware, a lot of early mathematics coincided with musical theory. If you actually look at musical theory, it's really based on mathematics. Quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes and whole notes, and much of musical theory is based on mathematics. There are actually a lot of similarities in the two. All these thinkers emphasize what we call rationalism. This notion that we could support an argument through the use of evidence, through the use of logic, rather than through simple authority of religion or government. In other words, we could explain everything. Even if we don't know the answers, we can try to explain everything through the idea of using an argument supported by evidence and logical conclusions, rather than simply believing in religion or that our political leaders say so. This was astounding, game-changing, but it wasn't. That's the problem. These guys, the ideas, the philosophies, the thoughts, the advanced rationalistic thinking, after the fall of Greece, these ideas that we see here literally disappear for 2,000 years. Most of the stuff we see talked about by these Greeks, we won't actually see Europeans looking at again with any seriousness for another 2,000 years. I often, when I do this part of the chapter, I often think, what if we'd kept advancing? The science and theories that many of these early natural philosophers were putting forth, we don't see again really looked at for 2 millennia in Western civilization. Could you imagine if we'd actually kept advancing back then? Could you imagine? It's hard to believe. It's just hard to believe. We've been on the moon 1,000 years ago instead of, 60 years ago. 50 years ago. It's just hard to believe. It really is. That we were so close here to true, real scientific breakthroughs that would have changed everything. And it goes nowhere. It dies with these handful of people. These couple I mentioned, and of course there's some others. It just dies with them. And we really don't see any other ideas come out again for 2 millennia. It's just hard. It just makes me wonder, where would the world have been had people like this kept advancing, and we'd actually moved into an era of like science and we have the scientific revolution, which happens in the 1700s or something, CE, 2,000 years after this. Well, goodness, not 2,000 years, 2,200 years after this. It amazes me when I think about it, where the world could have been had things kept moving along this path instead of this path being shut off. This new belief that humans weren't necessarily just subject to the whims of the gods gave some people hope, and some people simply believed now that they could have status, prosperity, and happiness through their own volition, through their own deeds, not simply in their own efforts, not simply the whims of some deity. It influenced Western civilization, but it's like difference between influence here and influence here, where it really could have grown to. Here we have a statue of a Greek woman, marble. They really loved marble. You can see her clothes and her head, which indicates status, the long hair, the head covering. She has a smile of satisfaction. She seems happy. We even have a name for this archaic smile or something like that it's called. I guess you'd have to ask I don't know, ask someone who studies humanities. There's actually a term for this archaic look. They were happy people, generally speaking. This is really, other than some hiccups in the road, this was generally an era of a golden age, or entering into a golden age. The Greeks had everything. Democracy, science, learning, wealth, power, prosperity. They had a lot. Everything seemed to be going for them. Until the wars. Until the Peloponnesian Wars, the Persian Wars. For a while, it really seemed like the Greeks just had it all. And then it all comes crashing down on them. There's Lesbos, there's Ionia, which this is Asia Minor. You can see its Greek territories here. You can see the islands of Greece, Athens, and the extended lands of Greece and Asia Minor. And we can see pretty much everything we've talked about. You can see Egypt. You can see the expanding and growing Persian Empire getting bigger and bigger. You can see where the Persians conquered Babylon, freeing the Jews, and then the Jews went back towards Israel, towards Jerusalem, and what happened then? They simply were conquered again by the Persians. You can see Troy there, Athens, Sparta, Corinth. And by this point in time, the Romans are forming a civilization as well. Over here in Italy, around Rome, we have the Roman civilization starting to develop. It's going to be a couple chapters before we get there. But so one thing about a lot of these chapters are crossing over time periods. There's a lot of overlap. Because we're talking about different things in different chapters. So there is a lot of overlap in some of these chapters. But we're not covering the same material. It's different. Even if there's some similar time periods, we'll be covering different things. Okay. Well, lots of good discussion questions in this chapter. Lots of things to talk about. Lots of comparisons and things. Lots of imagery. So, lots of things to think about. I appreciate you going through it with me. And we will call it right there. Later.